Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us right now, we are incredibly glad you're here.
Absolutely.
Today we're working from a single, highly comprehensive source. It's a detailed Wikipedia article simply titled War Economy.
Right.
And our mission for this deep dive is to look way past the battlefield. We really want to uncover exactly how nations completely rewire their financial, industrial, and social systems to fund and sustain conflicts.
Yeah, it's about seeing that hidden machinery, the money, the factories, the civilian sacrifice that operates completely silently behind the scenes of history.
Okay, let's unpack this, because there's a detail we're looking at today from the source that completely recontextualizes normal life.
The clock thing.
Exactly. If you look at the clock on your wall right now, the time it displays, specifically if you happen to be observing daylight saving time, was directly introduced as a tool of a war economy.
It really makes you realize how mundane details of our everyday lives are just artifacts of massive global conflicts.
It's wild.
It's the perfect example to start with, though. It shows how all-encompassing this whole topic is. To ground our discussion, we have to look at how the foundational concept is defined in our source.
Right, the Philippe Le Bihan definition.
Yeah. We're looking at his definition where he describes a war economy as a system of producing, mobilizing, and allocating resources to sustain the violence.
Sustaining the violence. That is a chilling but highly accurate summary.
It is. And what it means for you as an everyday citizen is that the fundamental purpose of your nation undergoes this radical overnight transformation.
The primary goal of the economy is just no longer civilian prosperity.
Right. It's not about personal wealth or producing consumer goods anymore. The entire engine of the state pivots exclusively toward survival and military output.
So if a government wakes up one day and decides civilian prosperity is no longer the goal, how do they actually pull that off? What levers are they pulling to rewire an entire country's economy?
Well, we're talking about massive, sudden interventions.
Like raising interest rates to curb civilian spending.
Exactly. And introducing strict resource allocation programs where the government suddenly dictates who gets steel and who gets rubber. They enforce strict rationing.
Or even the conscription of citizens. And not just for the front lines, but for civil defense and factory work. It's a total takeover of normal market forces.
Total takeover is the right phrase. But what's fascinating is that they don't necessarily kill capitalism to do it. They just put it on a very tight leash.
The market forces are paused.
Yeah, the state points the invisible hand exactly where it wants it to go. And this brings us to a really fascinating economic debate from the source concerning aggregate demand. Have you ever heard of military Keynesianism?
I have, but let's break it down.
It's the idea that a government's massive military budget can actually be used to stabilize business cycles.
Like an artificial heart for the economy.
Exactly. You pump money into defense contracts and it forces capital back into the system. It creates jobs, builds factories, and essentially acts as a lever to fight off recessions when private businesses are too scared to spend.
But there is a massive counterargument to that approach in the text, which I found incredibly compelling.
The Seymour-Melman argument.
Yes. You have the perspective of economists like Seymour Melman, who argued that there's a huge long-term downside to using that artificial heart. Melman pointed out the inherently wasteful nature of military spending.
Because it doesn't build long-term civilian value.
Right. Unlike building a bridge or a civilian railway or a high-speed internet network, which generates economic value for decades, a lot of military production just doesn't give back to the civilian economy.
It's a one-way street.
Melman's point is that if you put all your brightest engineers and billions of dollars into designing a slightly faster missile, those engineers aren't designing better public transit or new medical devices or civilian infrastructure.
So you might get an incredible military, but your domestic technology and long-term economic health basically stagnate. This raises an important question. What happens when a country uses war not just to defend itself, but actively uses it as an economic strategy?
Oh, this is where it gets incredibly grim.
There is a very dark reality here in the source. Sometimes war is used as a last-ditch effort to prevent deteriorating economic conditions or severe currency crises.
So governments might intentionally expand employment in the military simply to fix their terrible jobs numbers.
Yes. And while they do that, they might simultaneously, and this is a grim phrase we have to look at, resort to depopulating segments of the population.
Wow.
They do this to free up scarce resources and attempt to forcefully restore economic and social order when everything else has failed.
If you just think about your own town for a second, Imagine the local factories suddenly stopping production of cars or appliances, your neighbors getting drafted just to fix a national unemployment crisis, and your local grocery store capping what you can buy to stabilize a failing currency.
It completely changes the fabric of daily life.
It does. And we actually see this vividly when we look at the American engine during the 20th century. Let's start with World War I, which brings us back to that tease about the clock on your wall.
Right. The mobilization in the United States during World War I involved expanding governmental powers on a scale no one had ever really seen.
They created sweeping institutions.
Like the War Industries Board to micromanage military production.
Yeah.
But the most relatable one for everyday life is the Fuel Administration.
They're the ones who introduced daylight saving time in the U.S.
They are, and their goal wasn't about giving farmers more time or making summer evenings nicer. It was purely to save massive amounts of coal and oil for the war effort.
By maximizing daylight hours and reducing the need for artificial lighting.
Exactly.
And then you had the Food Administration, which took a slightly different, much more psychological approach.
They push for voluntary action rather than forcing it.
Yeah, instead of the mandatory heavy-handed rationing we might assume, they encouraged higher grain production and mobilized a spirit of self-sacrifice.
They wanted the public to feel like they were proudly volunteering to skip certain foods.
And the way they achieved that public buy-in was through an absolutely massive propaganda machine. You had an investigative journalist named George Creel.
He organized something called the 4-Minute Men.
Yes.
The sheer scale of that operation is remarkable. These were volunteers who would stand up in public places to deliver thousands of short 4-minute speeches.
I always laugh thinking about this. Imagine trying to just watch a silent film in a theater in 1917, and suddenly a guy stands up in the aisle and spends 4 minutes passionately yelling at you to eat less wheat.
It sounds absurd now.
It totally does, but incredibly, it worked. They rallied the public to support tax initiatives and food conservation. It was highly effective at generating localized support across the entire country.
It was a brilliant use of localized peer pressure and patriotism, but as massive as World War I was, it was essentially just a warm-up.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because if World War I was a test run for the U.S. war economy, World War II was the total absolute integration of it.
The scale is just unmatched.
And when you look at what actually sparked this unprecedented shift, it wasn't just Pearl Harbor.
No, the catalyst actually began much earlier.
Right. It began across the Atlantic with the fall of France, the Dunkirk evacuation, and the Battle of Britain. Those specific events shocked Washington into realizing they needed to convert to a wartime economy immediately.
Which led to the passing of the Two-Ocean Navy Act in July 1940.
And then, of course, the 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor prolonged and massively expanded those measures.
The financial logistics required to execute that expansion are staggering to think about. The government recognized they needed a gargantuan bureaucracy just to handle the mobilization of money.
Because they had to foot an enormous bill.
Yeah, so they raised taxes significantly, which ended up paying for roughly half the costs of the war.
Half is a huge chunk.
Yeah.
But to cover the other half, they had to borrow.
They issued war bonds, and they didn't just lean on everyday citizens buying bonds at the post office. Commercial institutions played a massive role.
The banks got involved.
Heavily involved. Commercial banks bought billions of dollars of bonds holding more than $24 billion in treasury paper by the end of the war.
They essentially leveraged the entire private banking sector to underwrite the conflict.
Yeah, exactly.
And to manage all the physical resources bought with that money, they created agencies like the War Production Board.
They were the ones awarding defense contracts and ruthlessly allocating scarce resources.
Things like rubber, copper, and oil. If you owned a business that made bicycles or refrigerators, you suddenly couldn't get the steel you needed.
The board was essentially forcing private businesses to completely tear down and convert their assembly lines.
And the output of that conversion was a literal production miracle. You're talking about a country mass-producing Liberty ships, North American P-51 Mustang aircraft, Willys MB Jeeps, and M4 Sherman tanks.
A car plant wasn't making sedans anymore.
No, it was churning out heavy artillery and tanks by the hour.
To really put a number on the scale of that manufacturing, by the end of 1943, 2/3 of the American economy had been integrated into the war effort.
Just let that sink in for a second.
2/3 of the entire economic output of one of the largest nations on Earth was dedicated strictly to sustaining the conflict.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. This massive, unprecedented cooperation between the government and private entities is arguably the primary engine that led the Allies to victory. It was an overwhelming flood of logistics and manufacturing.
But there's another side to this history in our source. When we look at Germany's approach, it presents a very dark, very different model of mobilization.
It wasn't about a domestic production miracle at all.
It was about extraction. Looking back at Germany in World War I, their centralized planning had some catastrophic failures. They aggressively conscripted their agricultural workers and funneled whatever food they had straight to the troops.
Predictably, that caused massive domestic food shortages for the people left behind.
And the German authorities' response to those shortages completely failed.
Because you can't just legislate food into existence.
Right. They tried to implement a food rationing system and set several strict price ceilings to stop people from speculating and profiteering off the starvation of their neighbors.
But those measures simply did not work. The black market exploded and the economic devastation was incredibly severe.
Which perfectly sets the stage for World War II. After the total economic collapse following World War I, the Nazis introduced new policies before the Second World War even began.
They drastically dropped the national unemployment rate, which looked like a miracle on paper.
But they did it by creating a massive war machine that was in clear, blatant violation of the Treaty of Versailles.
Exactly. They implemented a national draft and initiated a massive factory building program to supply an expanding military.
This created millions of jobs for a German population that was absolutely desperate for work.
But it was an illusion of true economic recovery. The hidden cost was a ticking time bomb of sovereign debt.
The numbers on this are wild.
By 1939, right before the war officially started, government debt stood at over 40 billion Reichsmarks. To translate that into modern terms, that is equivalent to 178 billion euros in 2021.
That is a completely unsustainable financial burden.
They were spending money they didn't have to build an army they weren't supposed to have.
And because it was unsustainable the moment the war began, they had to resort to extortion and exploitation. They simply couldn't fund the war internally.
No, they had to look outward.
To sustain their war effort, Germany systematically drained the economies of the countries they conquered. The text points to France as the most significant example, because France had one of the biggest and most highly developed economies in Europe at the time.
The statistics on this extortion are genuinely shocking.
During the occupation, the French economy was literally forced to provide 11% of Germany's total national income.
That extraction from France alone was enough to cover 5 whole months of Germany's total income during the war.
And they achieved this through outright theft, extortion, and forced labor.
A glaring example is the quartering fee imposed on Vichy France during the early months of the occupation. France was forced to pay 20 million Reichsmarks every single day to Germany.
20 million every single day.
Every day. The official polite explanation was that this fee was necessary to pay for the cost of the Nazi occupation forces. But in reality, that immense flow of daily capital was being siphoned off directly to fuel the broader German war economy across all fronts. What's fascinating here is the stark contrast in macro strategies.
Yeah, the difference is night and day.
You have the United States, which utilized massive domestic public-private cooperation and citizen investment through bonds to build an internal, albeit heavily regulated production engine.
And then you have Nazi Germany.
Right, which attempted to fuel its unsustainable debt and military expansion through the ruthless exploitation, extortion, and economic draining of occupied nations.
It shows how the underlying mechanics of a war economy can look vastly different depending on the regime's ideology and baseline resources. So what does this all mean for us today? Because a war economy isn't just something trapped in black and white photographs. We have to bring this concept right into the modern era, looking at the contemporary United States.
It's highly relevant today.
The reality outlined in our source is that the U.S. has been involved in numerous military endeavors in the Middle East and Latin America since the 1960s.
And has been in a continuous state of war since the September 11 attacks.
And when we talk about the sheer scale of modern defense economics, the numbers are astronomical. The U.S. possesses an annual military budget larger than those of India, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and France combined.
The scale is massive.
We are, of course, just presenting the scale of these numbers impartially as we look at defense economics, but it really highlights how incredibly vast and permanent a modern defense apparatus can become.
It's a massive macro example of sustained military spending. But we also have a very recent micro example in the source that proves the core principles of a war economy apply to nations of literally any size.
Right. We can look at Armenia during the 2020 Second Nagorno-Karabakh War.
Here you have a relatively small nation in the Caucasus operating under blockade, and yet they rapidly and completely mobilized their economy.
After 2018, they increased their military budget, significantly reaching $640 million.
And by 2019, that military spending accounted for a massive 18.8% of the country's total budget.
And it wasn't just about moving money around on a spreadsheet. Just like the historical examples from the 1940s, they had to instantly concentrate their human capital.
Armenia declared mobilization.
Instantly gathering volunteers, pulling medical professionals from civilian hospitals, and moving soldiers to sustain the effort. It was a complete societal pivot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanics of national survival are universal.
They really are.
Whether you're looking at a global superpower retooling car factories to produce thousands of tanks in the 1940s, or a small blockaded country in 2020 shifting nearly 20% of its entire national budget to defense overnight, the fundamental rules remain remarkably consistent.
The state must override normal economic behavior.
It has to aggressively allocate money, raw materials, and human lives toward the singular, all-consuming goal of conflict.
It really is a complete top-to-bottom rewiring of society.
Yeah.
Today, we've journeyed through the incredible hidden systems that make these conflicts possible.
It's been quite a dive.
We've seen how a war economy touches absolutely everything in a society. It dictates the national debt and international banking.
It redesigns the factory floors and decides what gets built.
It changes the food available on an everyday citizen's plate, and it even shifted the time on our clocks.
It's a powerful reminder that wars are fought just as much on spreadsheets, in banks, and on assembly lines as they are on the actual battlefield. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today, drawn from a very subtle but profound line we came across in the source.
What's the line?
It states that a temporary war economy can also be seen as a means to avoid the need for more permanent militarization.
The idea being that you pivot hard, fight the war, and return to normal.
Exactly. But when we look at the modern era where global powers maintain massive, continuous defense budgets year after year, decade after decade, it begs a really important question.
Right.
At what point does a temporary war economy simply become the permanent, silent baseline of a nation's regular economy? How much of our civilian life, our technological progress, and our overall society is shaped by an ongoing state of financial mobilization without us even realizing it?
That is a phenomenal question to end on, and it's something that definitely changes how you read the daily news. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you a brand new lens through which to view history and the complex world around you. Stay curious, keep looking past the obvious, and keep questioning the hidden systems that shape our world. We'll catch you next time.